Filmmaker Magazine presents Back to One with Peter Rinaldi.
Joshua Leonard is an actor. He sat down with me in Midtown Manhattan to talk about the work.
You land a role, you get the script, and what's the first thing you do?
I think the very first thing that I do is when I get a script that's something that I've been chasing after is start figuring out how I'm actually going to do the role as opposed to trying to convince people that I am capable of doing the role, which I think, and other actors might disagree with me, but I always feel like when you go to audition for something, and I've noticed this from both sides of the street, both auditioning actors as a director and auditioning as an actor for directors, that you're kind of looking for the ocean in the raindrop. When somebody just does a couple scenes, you also want to know that there's the breadth to also do the other aspects of the character. Whereas when you're actually doing the movie, you can be much more specific to the moment itself because you have the entire structure of the screenplay to play off of, and you can really hone in on what the emotional truth is of that given moment in a character's journey. But I do think there's a bit of a different thing when it comes to auditioning, where you want to show that you understand the other aspects of the character as well. So I think when the job is mine, I just start reading the script a bunch and start looking at how the macro arc that the character is going on is really broken down into bite-sized pieces and moments, because you never want to telegraph a resolution when you're in the middle of the hardship part of the journey.
And what's your relationship to the text? Do you start memorizing?
I'm terrible. I'm awful. My process is I read the script a bunch of times. I make some notes. If the role requires research for, specificity of a life situation that I'm unfamiliar with, I try to do some of that stuff. I don't focus on memorization too much. I find if I imprint it in my brain enough times, and then say it's 3/4 of the way there, and then get that last quarter of the actual rhythm of it and all the specifics of the script on the day with the actors when I'm doing it, that it keeps it a little fresh, which might just be my way of explaining away laziness on my part, but it seems to work. I should also say I don't do a lot of theater, and I've never worked with David Mamet. So, or as my wife, who did a show with Sorkin for years, I haven't done those shows where you really need to be word perfect.
Right.
And I think my technique would probably leave me flat on my face if I did have to do that. For better or for worse, I think, you probably want to ask other people, but I think one of the reasons I get hired is for a sense of a loose sense of naturalism within things, and that doesn't always mean I found the writers and directors who I've worked with for the most part to be incredibly collaborative in terms of, if there's a word off here, a word off there, that the most important thing being that we're getting to the heart and the truth of the moment, and kind of serving the scene. Again, there might be a whole collection of writer-directors out there who are secretly resentful at me for not being word perfect on their scripts, but it seems to have worked thus far, and another part of that, it comes out of having participated in quite a few films that were tightly structured, but completely improvised from a dialogue standpoint, where we kind of know the architectural purpose of the scene, but we don't know how we're going to get there until the day. Working with the Duplass guys, Humpday, my film, The Lie, that I directed, going back to Blair Witch, these were all films that didn't have any kind of written dialogue.
Speaking of that, did you ever work with someone who wasn't improvising on your level? And what did you do?
I've worked with people who are master improvisers, and I don't think of myself as a master improviser. If the role is right and I can wrap my mind around it, I can get pretty close. I always credit, for example, on Humpday, I credit Nat Sanders, who edited that film, as, along with Lynn, Shelton, as being the people who took, essentially what you're doing is you're writing what's a first draft. And what's great about a first draft is you are completely uninhibited by preconceptions of what something should be. So you get, so there's a freshness to it, which is really fun and exciting. There's also a lot of chaff and missteps. And so when you're doing a film like that, you really rely on a good editor to take the exciting spontaneity that comes along with that part of that type of process, and their ability to hone that in so it's not all over the place. Because I think there's 1,000 terrible versions of every improv film that I've ever done, and certainly somebody who wasn't an adept storyteller in the editing room could have made a bunch of bad movies out of the things that we said. So I think being a good improviser also relies heavily on working with a team that's going to take that and hone it in the editing room. That said, I have worked with actors who just don't like improvising. And I respect, my wife, Alison Pill, is one of them. She likes a script. She does not like to improvise. She's really a text is God kind of person. And I respect that. And I think she's got a specific skill set that I'll probably never have. I mean, what I do in that looseness, as we said, it doesn't apply to Mamet, it doesn't apply to classics, it doesn't apply to Chekhov, it doesn't apply to Shakespeare. I might fail miserably trying to do those things. And so I think part of it just comes along with the fact that because Blair Witch was my entree into what later became my career, I really kind of came in sideways in a way that happened to work for me, that happened to play to a strong suit. And I've been fortunate enough to sustain a career doing that. But I certainly don't think being a good improver is the sign of a good actor. I just think it's one tool in the toolbox. It's one, color in the palette.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you said something interesting there that I just want to focus on. You're doing the first draft. You mean as an actor with the other actors improvising, and then you kind of mean like the second draft or the final draft is the editing.
Absolutely. When you're improvising all the dialogue, again, to go back to Humpday or The Lie or even Blair Witch, some of those scenes that were 4 to 6 minute scenes in the final film were 30 to 35 minutes as shot, especially with now working much more with digital cinema and not having to worry about the expensive film or the fact that a mag is going to run out after 4 minutes and you only have a certain amount of time, that you can really get going and riff. That said, the 30-minute version of that scene is super circuitous and kind of fucking boring. So it is very much a first draft in that way. And then what an editor will do is take that raw material and that basic shape that you've formed, even if it's, they'll take this long meandering arc and kind of tighten it into what it needs to be to serve the film, which is probably a 5-minute scene that says the exact same thing, just says it more directly. But I think what you get in there is, the phantom limb of naturalism, of, stumbling to find thoughts, and the way that, our synopses actually fire in the midst of a conversation, which is oftentimes not in concise, direct thoughts. There's a stylization to dialogue that if you actually said it in real life would be super off-putting. It was one of the things when I saw Mark and Jay Duplass's Puffy Chair for the first time, it was one of the things that blew me away about that film, was watching it. There were whole strings of sentences in that movie that I felt like I had said in my own life verbatim. It really had a ring of truth to it. And, you think about Mike Lee, who does work with a script, but his script is entirely made up of dialogue that he's come up with through workshopping improv with the actors. They do their first pass in a black box room and then make a script out of it and then go perform that, whereas we do our first pass in front of the camera. Mm-hmm. and then somebody else has to deal with it later in the editing room.
What do you really need from a director as an actor? Like, you're a director yourself. Like, how has your directing changed you as an actor when you are acting in other people's films? And what do you need from a director?
One of the things that's really changed for me as an actor since starting to direct myself is I've stopped laying so much weight on the shoulders of how something feels inside me when I perform it, because I really, within a certain range, certainly, but I think I would approach a scene and I would think, I'm gonna know when I got the right take, because it's gonna feel like I got the right take. It's gonna feel like it was all honest. And I would keep asking for takes until I felt that way. And then as a director, especially with a film like The Lie, where I directed myself, which meant that I was then in the editing room, editing myself, realizing that that a lot of those times where I'm looking for something perfect that feels perfect inside, it's not the way it's reading on camera. I would find two things. One is sometimes it was just way better when it wasn't as clean, when it was, people always talk about, that like the Leonard Cohen, there's a crack in everything and that's how the light gets through, the wabi-sabi, the imperfections making something that much more potent. And so this striving towards the perfect take as an actor, actually sometimes sterilizing it in a way that's less interesting. And then the other thing that you sometimes find is, those 3 takes that felt so different to me, they look basically the same when you watch them back. So I have become hopefully way less of a pain in the ass to directors that I work with in terms of needing to feel that something's right if they tell me that they got what they needed. Mm-hmm. I think that's one major change. The other thing that I'll say is part of what's important about, at least what I've found is a crucial tool to me as an actor, is knowing that you can't come up with a list of demands for your director, because you're gonna get all different kinds of directors. And some directors are amazing with actors, and really want to get into the touchy-feely and just go there. And some directors, it's just not their bag. They're more technical people, and they're thinking about the shots, and they're thinking about how the shots are going to look, and then occasionally you get a director who's great at all of it and approaches it holistically, and that's fantastic. But you never know what you're going to get. And I will also say that some of those directors who aren't great at talking to actors or working with actors sometimes make great fucking films with great fucking performances in them. So I think it's our job as actors to do enough work that we show up and can do our job if we're not getting what we think we need. Both as a director and somebody who's now written a bunch more, what I can pull myself outside of the character and go like, if I'm not understanding what I need to do in a scene as an actor, I can sometimes have a conversation about what the utility of the scene is within the larger arc of the story being told. And that's helpful. I think I can speak that language of like, what do you need this scene to do?
Yeah.
And then I can reverse engineer that into something that's playable as an actor.
I imagine it was very freeing to work in front of an iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about it.
Making Unsane was one of those experiments that that I would have been way more scared about if Steven Soderbergh wasn't the guy holding the iPhone. Because at the end of the day, if it works or if it falls on its face, it's kind of his to win or lose. And honestly, I don't know for sure, but I don't know that he gives a fuck. I think part of what was so enticing about this project, and let me just step back and say I'm not playing cool. Of course, when Steven Soderbergh called me and said he wanted to do a film with me, I said yes, and it didn't fucking matter what it was. So all the excitement about the actual project came after the fact because it was a preemptive yes. But what Steven said in our very first conversation was, if the iPhone technology existed, which now we shot this film on the iPhone 7, which shot 4K native. If this technology existed when I was 15 years old, it's all I would be doing with my time. And that's what I want to do. I want to go out and make a film with nobody. I want to make it fast. I want... I think one of the things we discussed a lot was this notion of how exciting it is when you can reduce the time between impulse and execution, and how much amazing stuff can exist in that place that so often you don't get to have on a film. There's not a ton of spontaneity on a film set that's got a crew of 150 plus people and takes 2 hours to set up a shot because you have to move the lights around the room. I think nobody's working at their spontaneous best at that point. That said, we're not going to go make Dunkirk on an iPhone. Mm-hmm. It works for a specific type of project, and I think this was a film that lended itself to going fast and really trying to ride initial impulses right into the scenes themselves. The iPhone is such an omnipresent piece of technology in all of our lives at this point that it completely removes any sense of elevation. You're no longer making film with a capital F. when you've got an iPhone in your face. So I think there's something so fucking freeing about that, because it really just becomes, and also I'll say from a psychological standpoint, it takes up much less space in a room. So it's no longer the focus. It's no longer, Susan Sontag always used to make the analogy of a camera being like the barrel of a gun. And I think even on a subconscious plane, when you've got one of these big cameras with a big lens and it's pointed at you in the scene, I mean, maybe Daniel Day-Lewis can ignore it and not see it, but I am certainly not. There's always, you try to push the awareness back in your mind, but there's always an awareness there because you've got this huge piece of machinery and you know its sole purpose is to record your every tick. And with the iPhone, it's just this little tiny thing that you see in your life all the time. So it removes the self-consciousness. You're just kind of able to be in a room and be with the other actor. And this film, especially on some of the more intimate scenes, when we would go in a room to shoot a scene, it would be one guy recording sound, Steven holding an iPhone, and a lot of times it was just the two actors. So some of those padded room scenes between Claire and I, it was 4 people in that room, as opposed to 20 people, in many situations on a bigger film. So you're just so much lighter on your feet. Not that the iPhone is without its own aesthetic to some extent, but I also think we're doing a lot of talking about the iPhone with this movie because it's still pretty novel. Sean Baker did it with Tangerine, and I think that was a film that stood on its own with or without the iPhone, but there was certainly a lot of discussion around it. And now this, putting this movie out on a bunch of screens, and it was shot on an iPhone. That said, hopefully if we've done our jobs right, after the first 2 minutes of the film, I don't think anybody's going to be thinking, oh, this was shot on an iPhone. Which is a big difference technologically speaking between when we made Blair Witch and now, which was when we made Blair Witch on digital technology. The only way to do it was to have the conceit that these are student filmmakers who had a cheap camera and that's why the film's going to look like shit. Whereas with this one, I don't think if nobody told you that this film was shot on an iPhone, I don't think anybody would know. Steven's fascinating to work. I loved working with him as an actor. He's very respectful of actors. He's not a micromanager at all. That said, he is one of the least indulgent filmmakers I have ever worked with. Maybe the least indulgent filmmaker I've ever worked with, in the sense that he is so clear about what he needs. You'll look at a scene, you'll look at a page-long monologue that you have, and he'll come to you and give you the information, which is, I'm going to set the camera up in the corner, and I'm going to use this angle for these 3 sentences. At which point, I'm going to cut down to this angle, and I'm going to use that from this word until this comma. At which point I'm going to cut, and he'll give you the information as to exactly what he's going to do. That said, he'll also say, if you want to start earlier and ramp into it, if you want to go later, whatever helps you in your process to get there, you are welcome to do. But in terms of what I'll be using, if you just want to do those 3 sentences, you're also welcome to do that. Because he's already edited the film in his mind, and as soon as he leaves set, he gets on his laptop and puts it together. The night of the wrap party for Unsane, we all went bowling, and Steven sat at the bowling alley on his laptop, I think he had a drink, but mostly he was just on his laptop while we were all horsing around and bowling. And then he came over to Claire and I as the party was winding up, and he said, "If you want to come back to my room, I have a cut of the entire film for you to watch." As soon as the wrap party was over, and we had shot all day that day, we went back to Steven's hotel room and watched the movie from start to finish. 3 days after that, I came back to my family in Los Angeles, and 3 days later, I got a text from him that just said, "Picture locked!" exclamation point.
That's
It's insane. It's insane.
And this was his thing all along. Let's do this fast, because I can.
Because I can, and the technology exists, and he's a guy who doesn't have much more to prove. I think once you reach that level, so much, and again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my hypothesis is that he's a guy who's going to make much more interesting experiments for himself than, the obstacle course of working through the traditional industry and system of making a film. I think he's way more interested in the challenges that occur to him through his process of creation than proving anything to anybody else.
Right. This character you're playing in this is quite different than maybe anything you've done before.
I keep getting offered bad guy roles, and I'm not sure what it is. I actually started feeling really bad about it recently. It's like, is it this moment in history where
just the white man is the bad guy?
Where like the white man is the bad guy, which, historically deservedly so.
Right.
But or am I pheromonally releasing something, which also just happens to, I've got, my wife and I just had our first kid. She's 16 months old. So there's something about being a new dad and playing bad guys that makes me feel weird in a way that I don't think it would have ever made me feel before.
Right.
And
when you're single, you want to be the bad guy, right?
Sure, and it's fun, and there's no, there's nobody who's going to, make you feel guilty or dirty if they see you being a bad guy. I don't want my daughter to ever watch this film, ever. So this was definitely a different character than I had played before. He's a character pretty devoid of self-awareness. Mm-hmm. I mean, look, I can be an obsessive. I think most people I know can be obsessive about one thing or another. I think it's part of what draws us into this field. There are things that to a normal sane person seems silly and superfluous, that I will stay up till 6 o'clock in the morning trying to make better or perfect. Sleep be damned, health be damned. So it's not that I don't understand an obsessive personality. I think especially now, I've been in therapy for 20 years. You try to take your obsession and not hurt other people with it. And David Strine, who I play in this film, is just a guy who never learned not to do that. As we've heard all the actors who have played bad guys talk about, you don't approach it as a bad guy. You don't approach it as I tend to be somebody who believes that nobody sits around going like, what's the most nefarious thing I can do, and twirling their mustache. Maybe Martin Scarelli, but I'm sure in his mind, unless he's a sociopath, which is also possible, that that there's some real justification behind why he is the way he is. Another thing that was helpful, I have an acting coach who I met with a couple of times on this role, and a lot of what we talked about was the obsessive love of adolescence, and how when you haven't loved and lost, and you haven't dealt with when you haven't dealt with a ton of real world stakes yet, and you have all these fucking hormones coursing through your body, how obsessive and all-encompassing love can be and feel, and how it seems like the only thing. You have blinders on, you can't see past it, and so to try to tap back into that place and go like, what if I never grew out of that? What if that's still the way that love felt, was the way it did when I was 13? Mm-hmm. And then you add to that the kind of Lenny in Of Mice and Men aspect, but now you're a big adult man who, in my case, like twice the size of Claire. So you're just a teenage emotional state with a big heavy body is a dangerous combination. And I think that's a lot of what David's doing in this, is he's just not emotionally prepared to deal with the feelings that he has, and kind of knocking over anything that's in his way of getting to the one thing that he wants and he loves and he thinks he needs.
You felt like you could benefit from an acting coach on this. Part of me would think, well, that's because there's something you're not getting from Soderbergh.
Personally, the reason that I work with an acting coach, especially being somebody who wasn't classically trained and didn't go to school for acting, but the reason that I work on specific roles with an acting coach is to allow myself to be nimble and have flexibility and not be, because if I come in only with my preconceptions and only with my set of preparation, if somebody asks me to think of something differently or try something differently, it's going to be hard for me to get there, because I'm only working within this kind of limited purview of the way that I perceive something. When I take on a role, I've got the limit of my own experience. I've got the limits of my own vanity and ego. I've got, the limits of my own fear. And so I hand it off to somebody else who I trust. In this case, Lee Kilton Smith, who's an acting coach that I've worked with a number of times, and say, tell me all the things that I'm too blind to see about this. So I can look at it and add ideas. So on the day when I get to set, I have the ability to move left or right with, I have a more holistic understanding of who this character could be than I would come up with on my own. When I'm directing an actor and they want to work with a coach, I am never threatened by that. I am thrilled by that, because I really think the more work somebody puts in, and the more ways that they can think about it, and the more angles that you can think about a character from, the more colors you have in your palette when you get to set. And you haven't already galvanized it into this thing where if you're playing off another actor and they don't do what you assumed they were going to do, because when you're reading a script and you read the other roles, you think you know how an actor is going to say something. because that's the way that you would say it. And then you show up on set and that's not the way they say it at all, which means your character would respond differently than you did to the actor who was in your head. So I think it's really important to keep a character alive and open to possibilities that you wouldn't necessarily come up with on your own. I think,
and you mean, yeah, when you say alive, you mean like living in order and able to react.
Yeah, without, which goes back to my process / laziness, which is make strong choices, but don't make those strong choices in a rigid way that's not going to allow you to react to the circumstance that you're actually in when the camera's rolling and you've got another actor opposite you, because you need to be alive and receptive to that. I think that's what keeps a character alive, and it's what keeps a film alive. Mm-hmm. And certainly what keeps me on my toes and keeps me coming back to doing this is the process of collaboration. There are far more solipsistic fields that I could have picked if I just wanted to stay in my own head and chat with myself all the time. I think I like doing this because I'm always learning from the people around me.
Joshua Leonard, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Peter.
Back to One is a production of Filmmaker Magazine, which is a publication of IFP, the Independent Filmmaker Project.